Hey guys, this is the last lecture for period 5, and this is the end of the Civil War and putting the nation back together, and that is called Reconstruction. So, this is a really famous cartoon from the time period. I always like to show it to students because it always ends up being somewhere on the AP exam every few years. And this rendition it shows the future of African Americans and the past of African Americans in the country because of the Civil War. So, over here in the past, the left is the past. You see war and destruction. You see a slave auction and the part of the domestic slave trade. You see beatings and whippings and people being sold away from their families. And over here on the right, you see what they value the most: emancipation up at the top. And you see them going to public school, a mom sending her children to public school. You see them owning a house up here in the top. You see them going to a bank down here in the bottom right corner and talking to the cashier. And the biggest thing that they were looking most forward to was being able to live in harmony with their family and not be split up via slave auctions. So, what they hallow the most, what they want the most, is the family ties that they have been ripped of due to the institution of slavery, and they owe it to Abraham Lincoln in their eyes. Okay. So the actual term Reconstruction means it's an attempt to bring the country back together while improving the status of former slaves. And from here on out, we call them freedmen. And that's what they were called at the time period. Okay. So they go through many phases of Reconstruction. Things change as Reconstruction continues. It starts at the end of the war in 1865. In April 1865, the war is declared over at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, when General Lee surrenders to General Grant. And the war's mostly over at that point. And Lincoln has been this whole time knowing that the North was going to win for a few months, and he put together a 10% plan, and we'll go over what that is in a minute, but like his plan to bring the country back together. But unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated and dies, so his plan is not put into action. So then we go through this phase of or different laws passed leading up to Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. And then President Johnson is put into power. He was the vice president, and President Johnson is not as full of grace as President Lincoln was. And he will put his presidential Reconstruction plan into work. But Congress goes against what President Johnson does and vetoes him multiple times. And so we go into a period of congressional Reconstruction. And the 14th Amendment is passed, which gives African Americans the right to citizenship. And finally, the last part is when a coalition of very radical Republicans takes over Congress in both houses, and they pass what they call military Reconstruction, and also the 15th Amendment, which gives African American men the right to vote. And finally, in 1876, sorry, my face is kind of covering it up, we get the end of Reconstruction, and it's kind of like this big dirty deal that ends Reconstruction, and we're going to go over that. So this timeline is basically the course of our lecture today. So after the end of the Civil War, towards the end of the Civil War, some big questions are lingering. Those big questions are, how do we rebuild the South? The North wiped through the South and destroyed their railroads, destroyed their factories, destroyed their towns. People are starving, set fire to their fields. Now we want to bring them back in. They're not really an asset unless we help them rebuild. Concerning African Americans and freedmen who live in the South, what will their rights be? They are freedmen. Will their rights as freedmen be guaranteed as white men's rights are guaranteed? How would the South be reintegrated into the Union? Do they get to just come back and we're going to give them a hug? Do they have to do a certain process? Are they going to be punished? And then who controls the process of Reconstruction? Is it Lincoln? Is it Johnson? Is it Congress? Is it the Southerners themselves? Should it be the military? There's these big questions about who has the constitutional right to do this process of readmitting the South. So the first thing that's done right after the war ends is the 13th Amendment. It abolishes slavery. There you go. Moving on. The first issue, let's tackle that first question. How do we rebuild the South? Essentially, think about your big towns in the South: Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, and Atlanta, Georgia are completely destroyed. And economically, the South is just in ruins. Banks had massive inflation due to the issuing of paper money that the Confederate Army did, and the lack of gold and silver that's in the South because it was all given to pay for war goods. Factories are closed or destroyed or burnt down or looted by the Union Army. Their transportation system was devastated. Their agriculture is in ruins as well. Those cotton fields had either been burnt to the ground or had just been left to waste after men had left and after slaves were freed. And so many fields are abandoned or completely destroyed, and that is their main source of money. Their livestock, like cows and horses and mules, had been taken by the Union Army or taken by freed slaves or even just slaughtered. And so this class of men that we looked at in the antebellum period before the war, where they're all chivalrous and they have money and it's like this southern genteel society, is just gone. Their mansions are destroyed. Their giant plantation systems are ruined. And those things weren't necessary, but they kept the economy going. So how do we rebuild a South where men are paid for their labor instead of enslaved is kind of the big question, because agriculture is what they can do. So how do they do that without free labor? Very early on, the Freedmen's Bureau is created in Congress in 1865, and its whole purpose is to help these freedmen, these ex-slaves who don't know how to read and write, aren't educated, don't know skills beyond what they had been doing when they were enslaved, don't have any money to start themselves off economically. So how do we help integrate those people into a society of Southerners that already hates them? Many members of the Freedmen's Bureau that go live in the South and try to establish it are former abolitionists, are white women. And what they do is set up like a government building that will teach and provide clothing and food and medicine and teach African Americans what it means to be a citizen and your right to vote and things like that. And the Freedmen's Bureau isn't just for African Americans, it actually does provide economic aid to poor whites as well. And what is so sad is that many African Americans, one of the first things they want to learn how to do is to read, because they have held close to a Christian faith, predominantly a Christian faith for freedmen, but had no access to scripture. Beyond what their preacher or a friend who could read gave them. So reading the Bible was very important, and that's one of the first things that they asked for, which is extremely heartbreaking, not being given the chance to read. But they will now get that chance. So here are some examples of the Freedmen's Bureau. Many times it is a white middle class woman who volunteers her time and is paid a government salary to go into the South and run a Freedmen's Bureau. And as you can see within this actual photo and this rendition of a school, it's not just children, it's adults that want to go to these schools and learn how to read too. This is also a very famous political cartoon that pops up every once in a while. Here we have white men and freedmen over here on the right, and this one man in the middle. And this one man is meant to represent the Freedmen's Bureau. He mediates the issues between the existing whites in the South and the freedmen. He mediates the issues between the white men that were living there and the newly freedmen who are now trying to enter the political, social, and economic sphere of the South. There was a lot of violence against the freedmen, though. So there was a lot of violence and backlash against those who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau. A slang term for them was the carpetbaggers, because they had suitcases that were made of these like kind of carpet looking oriental kind of material, and they would bring those suitcases down and people called them carpetbaggers. And that is the slang term for northern whites who come down to help freedmen learn to vote and get an education and be involved in the political, social, and economic sphere. And some whites and blacks who are participating or helping with the Freedmen's Bureau will be subject to lynchings and violence and threats. And even President Johnson, the president after Lincoln, he's a white supremacist, and he tries to veto the program multiple times and kill it, but Congress is able to override his veto. The Freedmen's Bureau is depicted in a couple of really nasty ways in white Southern newspapers. And I've shown you some primary source examples of these, and they're just disgusting. The white Southerner view of the Freedmen's Bureau was that it was government money that these people were living off of. And so like this one over here, the popular idea of the Freedmen's Bureau, plenty to eat and nothing to do, that it was giving African Americans a free pass and all of those things. And of course, African Americans are depicted in such a disgusting and awful way. It's the Freedmen's Bureau to keep them idle at the expense of the white man, vetoed by the president but made law by Congress. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. You see the white supremacist point of view within these cartoons where African Americans are depicted as living off government money. Well, they had no money. They had been enslaved. They didn't know how to read or write, the majority of them. And so they needed help from the government. The Freedmen's Bureau was a great program, but it met a lot of backlash. All right, so looking at presidential Reconstruction, we have two phases of it. Lincoln, who kind of like sets the idea that the president can make a plan and put it into action for Reconstruction, and then Johnson once Lincoln dies. So Lincoln's idea of Reconstruction was that it is the president's power. He's extending his executive power past the war. We talked about the executive power of Lincoln during the war. And his idea was that 10% of ex-Confederates in every state had to pledge allegiance to the Union. Like basically, like put your hand on a Bible, raise your right hand and say, I promise to never take up arms against the Union again. I promise to be a valuable citizen within the Union, like those sort of things. Literally take an oath. And then once 10% of white men, ex-Confederates, had done so, then the state can create a constitution, submit the constitution to federal Congress, and then be readmitted to the Union. And this was a very generous and lenient plan. Remember, Lincoln's whole idea was with malice towards none, full of grace, just come on back and we'll fix all of our problems kind of idea. But you and I both know Lincoln dies. So Congress doesn't like that idea. And the reason that they don't like that idea is it has no stringent rules for that planner society that was just in charge politically, socially, and economically. The white landowners, or those big plantation owners in the South, it doesn't allow them, it doesn't give rules to them that keep them from rising up to the top again and exploiting African Americans. So Congress is not a big fan of Lincoln's plan. And Lincoln is assassinated. While Lincoln is still alive, two congressmen, Wade and Davis, put forth, I'm sorry, I don't know their first names, put forth an idea that would make Reconstruction a congressional power and not an executive power. And it was passed by Republicans. It required a 50% oath. So we sometimes call it the 50% plan, where 50% of ex-Confederate white men in the South would have to say an oath. I promise to never take up arms and be loyal to the Union. And da, 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 da. But Lincoln pocket vetoed this bill because he wanted power of Reconstruction. He wanted it to be an easier process. And this plan would also have more safeguards for African Americans for emancipation and to keep that top planner class from rising to power again. So then Lincoln is assassinated, and Johnson now is in this stance where Lincoln has vetoed congressional Reconstruction, and he has power, executive power over Reconstruction. And he issues the 10% plan plus is what I like to call it. That's not what your textbook will call it. But the 10% plan plus. Basically, Johnson is a champion of poor whites, which is great. But what's not great about him is he only likes poor whites. He does not like the idea of emancipation. He was a former slave owner. So he doesn't like that those rich people, the rich white landowners, might take control again. He remember, he was just Lincoln's vice presidential candidate in the election of 1860, because Lincoln knew that he needed some border state support, and Andrew Johnson's from the South. He's from Tennessee. So Lincoln put him on the ticket. We didn't think he would be president. All of a sudden, Lincoln's assassinated a month after inauguration, and here we go. We've got Johnson as our president. So he is perhaps one of the most overtly racist and white supremacist presidents in U.S. history. So his 10% plus plan is that 10% of ex-Confederate state voters had to pledge allegiance to the Union. The state constitutions had to outlaw slavery. Anyone that was a leading Confederate officer or general could not vote, is not allowed in politics for a while. He did want to pardon the planter aristocrats, not because he wanted to, but because he knew that's how the economy would get rolling again. And he wanted to provide more federal programs to help poor whites in the South, because he grew up as a poor white, and that's kind of like where his heart was at. But his heart was not with the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau twice, and Congress was able to override those vetoes because he was racist. Oh, I told you all of these things. Make sure you write them down. Sorry. And this is my personal opinion, but it's true. All right. So the South, during this time period of 1865 to 1866, when the president President Johnson is able to enact some presidential reconstruction, the South totally takes hold of it and just runs with it. Basically, white Southerners had like this window of opportunity to like do whatever the crap they want in the South. While Congress is out of session, while the president has power of Reconstruction, they know the president's like kind of on their side. And so they start electing Confederate leaders to federal Congress and in other high offices like governors, and in their state legislatures. They pass a series of black codes, and we'll talk about black codes later. The KKK is founded in Tennessee, and these are like Southern whites fighting like this guerrilla warfare against freedmen for white supremacy. And so while Congress is just like this sitting duck while they're out of session, the South just goes hog wild and enacts all the things that Congress did not want them to enact again, and just makes it a situation very similar to what it was pre-war. So that's how, when Congress comes back in session, there's a coalition of Republicans that are very radical, called the Radical Republicans. And, sorry, let's go back to black codes. So black codes are laws that are only applicable, that are only laws for freedmen and free blacks. So like formerly free blacks, and then now the new free blacks that were slaves but now aren't. And let me give you some examples. Let me give you some examples. So think things like martial law. The military is in charge. It's forbidding some blacks from renting or leasing land, forbidding them to serve on juries or to testify against whites, forbidding them to own weaponry, not allowing them to vote, saying if you aren't involved in a labor contract, and they would be forced to sign labor contracts, then you're considered an idle black, and idle blacks can be forced to work for free, like slavery, okay? And the purpose of black codes was to demean and degrade African Americans into a system of race relations that is very much like slavery, but slavery with a new name. And it was successful. And so Congress sees this, and when they come back into session, they have this big reaction against it, and Congress goes pretty crazy with congressional Reconstruction, which is the next phase of Reconstruction, okay? So this coalition of Republicans are furious that they are sitting in Congress next to ex-Confederates, people who are high up in the Confederate legislature and Confederate military. They are reacting to a system of white supremacy being restored in the South. They are upset that the Southerners might win control of Congress. They are upset that Black codes could be implemented maybe at a federal level, not just a local and state level. And so that what they do next is kind of like wage this all-out congressional war against Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats, and that's kind of the party that is anti-Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866 is passed on a narrow margin, and it is passed in reaction to Johnson vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau, and they want to make something very strong and legislative to help African Americans. Basically, it gives Black citizenship and aims to destroy Black codes. It is the precursor to the 14th Amendment. So anything written in the Constitution is much stronger, but they wanted to pass it through legislation quickly. So Civil Rights Bill of 1866. Johnson vetoes it. The veto is overturned with a 2/3 vote. And this kind of starts the pattern of Congress and Johnson not getting along. And Johnson will eventually be impeached. So the 14th Amendment is basically take that Civil Rights Bill of 1866, turn it into an amendment so it can't be overturned. It would have to take a big process to repeal it. And the idea here is, again, give civil rights like citizenship, not voting rights yet, to African Americans. Bullet point right there. The teeth behind this is this isn't a voting rights bill. It doesn't give African Americans the right to vote, but it is a precursor to the 15th Amendment in that it will reduce the representation that your state has in federal elections if you are not guaranteeing Blacks the right to vote. So the idea was, well, they gave Blacks, they gave freedmen the right to vote in the South. That increases the amount of representation they have because it's no longer the 3/5 clause. It's everyone is a person, as they should be, and everyone is counted for representation in Congress. But if you deny African Americans the right to vote, but still use them for representation purposes in your population count, that's not fair. And so this is a precursor to the 15th Amendment that will give African Americans the full right to vote, which they're denied still. We'll get to that. So 1866, there's a congressional election. And radical Republicans just rule the roost here. They have a 2/3 majority in both houses now, and they're unstoppable. They can pass anything. They can overturn anything. And this is when they're like, here we go. This is our moment. We get to do Reconstruction the way we want to do Reconstruction. Okay? So here we go. This is Military Reconstruction Part 2. I like to call it Congressional Reconstruction 2, the Republicans' Revenge. But that's just funny. So you've got radical Republicans who are hoping to keep Southern states from the Union as long as possible and to enact drastic social and economic change. We've got some moderate Republicans that don't really want federal intervention in people's lives, but will get caught up in this radical Reconstruction thing. And so here is the Military Reconstruction Act, okay? It divides the South into 5 military districts, and each is commanded by a Union general and policed by the Union Army, about 20,000 soldiers in total. Every state that wants to rejoin the Union has to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. You have to allow Blacks to vote and guarantee that they have the ability to vote. However, it doesn't completely fully protect Blacks. It does provide for a stronger Freedmen's Bureau, but it stops short of giving freedmen land or education at federal expense. And this lasts about 2 years, 1866 to 1868. And it just stops just short of how far it could have gone. It doesn't make the federal government directly responsible for the protection of Black rights. And that will be a sticking point later on at the end of Reconstruction. So here are the military districts. There's a Union general and Union soldiers ruling over these places. Tennessee had already been readmitted to the Union, and so it was not under military Reconstruction, but all these other places had yet to be readmitted, and essentially The date on the left is the date that that they are admitted to the Union, and most of these are admitted under military Reconstruction. The date on the right is the right that conservative rule is kind of reestablished, and that date is the date that basically military Reconstruction ends in that area, and will the rights and the idea of Reconstruction will not be as protected there, okay? So, we're getting to a time period here where Johnson and Congress really don't get along, and Congress is able to override everything that President Johnson does. So we have the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. This is Johnson is vetoing a lot of things, and Congress has to go through the motions of overriding his veto. And Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act. The president can't remove Senate-approved appointees without approval of the Senate. So the Senate approves federal judges and different people within the cabinet and the bureaucracy and things like that. So it says that the president can't remove those people unless the Senate says they can, because the Senate appointed them. And the purpose is there is a radical Republican within the president's cabinet, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who they want to keep in the cabinet to spy for them. And so the whole purpose of this law is provoke Johnson into breaking the law and trying to fire this Edwin Stanton. And then he'll fire him and say, don't come back. And then they might have grounds to impeach Johnson. Johnson is over here saying, doesn't apply to me. Lincoln appointed that dude, not me. So it doesn't apply to me. So Johnson believes the act is unconstitutional. He takes the bait, and he fires this man, Edwin Stanton. The House votes to impeach him, 126 to 147. They call it high crimes and misdemeanors. But the Senate, when they are voting, so he is impeached, but he is not removed. When they're voting to remove, one person switches their vote, and he is not removed. However, as a president, he's sitting there, knows that he was impeached and was about to be removed. He's not going to do anything else. He just kind of sits there the rest of his presidency. The 15th Amendment is passed in 1869. It's ratified a little bit later after Johnson is out of office. And the purpose of it is to strengthen Black suffrage and put some teeth behind it in hopes that Southerners won't control Congress by electing a bunch of white Southerners. And so it's suffrage for Black males, but the hope is that it will boost the Republican Party in the South, because these African Americans, they're gonna vote Republican. And historically, African Americans voted Republican from this time all the way up until 1930 because of FDR. There is backlash, of course, against the 15th Amendment, and you guys are going to be going through this at a later time or maybe in class. And these are ways that African Americans were stopped from voting, regardless of the fact that they had the 15th Amendment right to vote. Poll taxes makes them pay. Well, they don't have money. Literacy tests, you have to read to vote. Well, they were never taught to read. Property requirements, they don't have property. Grandfather clause, I'm saying if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. Well, their grandfathers couldn't vote. And the idea of the grandfather clause was the poll tax, the literacy test, and property requirements weren't allowing poor whites to vote. And so Southern legislatures were trying to find a loophole around how do we get poor whites to vote but not African Americans, the grandfather clause. Gerrymandering, which we've talked about before, is like redistricting to try and make your party win. And then just pure intimidation with lynchings, mob violence, threats, and the KKK. The 15th Amendment got some backlash from women as well, because women weren't included. Female leaders of the abolitionist movement split off. They're angry. They're upset. Most of them are happy for their African American friends, but and supporters, but are upset that women did not get the right to vote as well. Oh, and here, this cartoon, did you have to wait long? A white man says to a black man, and a black man says only a few hundred years, because it literally will take 100 years, 1865 to 1964, before African Americans are guaranteed the right to vote. So what about in the South? The South ignored it because of all those laws. The Democratic Party will still reign dominant. You get a few African American congressmen that are elected to federal Congress, but that dies out. And then full black suffrage won't be accomplished until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, with great leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. All right, so let's talk about the end of Reconstruction. By 1870, all former Confederate states had reorganized their state governments, had been reintegrated into the Union. They adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The radical regimes, once they were readmitted, the military kind of left, and military reconstruction was kind of over. And that just left this breeding ground for white elites to dominate the political, social, and economic sphere again. And now it's like past the war. It's almost 10 years past the end of the war. Northerners are not as concerned with African American rights. They're concerned with other issues, like the Panic of 1873 that's going on in the North and hurting industry. And so there's just this like, oh, are we done with this yet? Idea. There's that mentality that they just want it to be over. And so Reconstruction will end long before it probably should have, and long before all the things that they meant to do were effective. So it all starts with a compromised election in 1877, an election between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and the results are inconclusive. Tilden led the popular vote and the Electoral College by 20 votes, but he didn't have enough electoral votes to win. 187 you need, he had 184. Because the split was so close. So there were about 20 electoral votes that were in question due to fraud in southern states and voter eligibility and things like that. And there was big contests. And you guys know this is 2020, the election of 2020. We're going through a similar thing right now where it's just like, who won? And so eventually there's a 15-member congressional commission that is charged with the job of figuring out who should win. And they come up with a compromise. The 20 contested electoral votes will be given to Rutherford B. Hayes. So 165 votes now up to 185 votes. And that would have him lead the Electoral College and end the debate. But they had to make a compromise to get there. The North was allowed to have Hayes as president. They wanted a Republican if Reconstruction ended and all troops were removed from the South. And that was the compromise that was brokered. So the man who probably wasn't supposed to win won the election. It was a dirty deal, but he had to give up something. The Republicans had to give up something, and so they gave up Reconstruction. They gave up putting the country back together and guaranteeing the rights of freedmen for Rutherford B. Hayes to be president. And so here's a pretty popular cartoon from Harper's Weekly at the time. It's a Southerner who is reaching for his gun and saying, Tilden or blood, a truce, not a compromise, a chance for high-toned gentlemen to retire gracefully from their civil declarations of war. We don't need to fight another war. And the hand is coming down saying, no, rest, brother, it is done. We no longer need to contest the election. Reconstruction has ended. Let's come together. Okay? So let's evaluate Reconstruction as a whole here. Some terms you might need to know. Carpetbaggers we've gone over, but scallywags on the left. Scallywags are Southern men who supported Reconstruction. It's a slang term. They're hated by Confederates. And carpetbaggers come down from the North to help in the South, but some are bad. Some are like, I know the South is in a rough shape, so I'm going to go down there and build a factory and make a bunch of money or economically exploit people. So not all carpetbaggers are good, nice people helping the Freedmen's Bureau, okay? And so this is a Southern view of a carpetbagger. The point of view of these cartoons are white Southern Democrats. On the left, we've got the Democratic Party, backed by the KKK, who has hung a carpetbagger from Ohio, from the north. And this man is a carpetbagger, and he just looks evil, right? He looks like he's got a bag full of money that he's stealing from the South, is kind of the idea. Okay, we've got the rise of the KKK. With the ending of Reconstruction, there's leaving this big vacuum where African American rights are not going to be supported. And that leads to violence, and that leads to the forming of the KKK in Tennessee right after the war. Essentially, the KKK is a rebellion against radical rule. It's a terror wing of the Democratic Party, and the goal is to overthrow those military governments in the South and replace them with white supremacy Democratic governments. And they use fear and intimidation and lynchings and mob violence and fire and violence to intimidate freedmen and carpetbaggers and scallywags and anyone who wants to change anything in the South. And they discourage Blacks from being involved in the political sphere by voting, or the economic sphere, or the social sphere, through fear and intimidation and violence. And they do so from this time period till the 1920s, when they resurge again, and there's even sections of the KKK still alive today. African Americans were not guaranteed their rights through a number of ways. And I'm going to talk about some of those ways here. And some of these ways you will see later. This is kind of like the road to institutional discrimination. So there's types of discrimination that are just part of the social, like everyone does them. And there are types of discrimination that are in law by the government. So sharecropping becomes a wide-scale practice to keep Blacks tied to plantation owners with cropland laws, which basically sharecropping would be, they say, oh, you want to work for me? Like a white former slave owner, you want to work for me? Well, I will give you a piece of land, and you can farm that piece of land, but you have to pay me back in crops. So it sounds like a good deal initially, and many African Americans are signed into these labor contracts, and they are contracts binding by law where you have to work for them for a certain number of years. Well, you can't always depend on crops, and oftentimes they went so into debt buying or renting horses and plows and seeds and things like that they ended up perpetually in debt to these white men, and debt's a form of slavery. So sharecropping in the cropland system is kind of like slavery with a different name. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses keeps them from voting. And then later on, the 1880s, Jim Crow laws will go into effect. And these are basically segregation laws in public facilities like schools and railroad cars and restaurants. Of course, lynchings, violence, and fear and intimidation by the KKK. And then Plessy versus Ferguson is actually a Supreme Court case where a man named Homer Plessy is a African-American man who looks very white. They call it passing as white. And he gets onto a white train car that has been segregated, and it gets in trouble for that. He sues, makes it up to the Supreme Court, and the whole case is about, can you segregate facilities and what is considered African American and not. And it is ruled that one drop of African American blood makes you Black, and facilities can be segregated as long as they are equal. And that's where the separate but equal clause comes from. And that separate but equal clause continues up until 1954 with Brown versus Topeka, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And those laws are in effect for almost 100 years. There are some positives from Reconstruction. There are steps taken towards adequate public schools. The Freedmen's Bureau helps educate African Americans. Tax systems were improved. Public works projects were launched to help rebuild the South and rebuild railroads and transportation in the South. Some property rights for even women are guaranteed. and property requirements were kind of eliminated for holding office. And so almost anyone can be elected, any white man can be elected before the South kind of takes control again of their society. But for the most part, Reconstruction was a major failure and did not accomplish what it set out to do. And that's why so many years later, there was a necessity. Well, there was a necessity from the beginning, but so many years later, it culminated in the necessity of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s that actually got African Americans the rights that they were guaranteed 100 years prior at the end of the Civil War. All right, that is all for this time period.